If you want reality to respond to you, you must train your mind in the way Carl Jung described, not through affirmations, not through vision boards, and not through simple positive thinking, but through something far more exact, more uncomfortable, and ultimately more powerful than what the self-help industry usually promotes. Most people fail to recognize one important truth. The reality you are experiencing right now is not random. Jung observed that your internal psychological condition and the events appearing in your external world are linked in a way that goes beyond basic cause and effect. He referred to this as synchronicity, not magic and not the law of attraction, but a more precise principle. When your inner world remains unexamined, the outer world continues to present situations and people that reflect your unresolved patterns. This does not mean you are directly creating these situations. Rather, your integrated psychology influences what you notice and how you respond to everything around you. Have you ever felt like you are speaking into emptiness, yet life keeps bringing you the same challenges, the same types of people, the same frustrations, and the same invisible barrier that you cannot seem to overcome, no matter how much effort you put in? That experience is not simply bad luck. It is your unexamined inner state shaping your reality, producing the conditions through which the same patterns continue to appear. Jung described this as the psychological mirror. Once you understand this mechanism, your view of external reality begins to change completely. He identified something many people spend their lives avoiding. There is a specific pattern embedded within your mind, and until you learn to examine it, life will keep repeating the same outcomes again and again. This is not just an idea, it is a process. In this discussion, we will break down how it functions, why it does not work for most people, and the exact steps Jung outlined to reshape it from the inside out. But before moving into those steps, there is something important that the self-help space rarely explains. The reason most people fail to change their reality is not a lack of effort. It is that they focus on the wrong area, like renovating a house while its foundation is already cracking. Carl Jung identified where the real issue exists, and that is exactly where we begin. To understand this properly, we need to look at what Jung actually discovered, because many people misunderstand it. He spent decades observing patients who appeared stuck, not because they lacked intelligence or motivation. In fact, many of them were among the most perceptive individuals in any environment they entered. They could read others with remarkable accuracy, sense underlying tension, identify emotional patterns, and see beyond social masks that misled everyone else. Jung referred to this in his clinical work as differentiated perception. These individuals were not imagining things. They were genuinely processing reality at a deeper level than most people ever reach. However, this led to a paradox that deeply concerned Jung. These same individuals, the ones who noticed everything, often had external lives that were unstable. They experienced broken relationships, stalled careers, and a constant feeling of being trapped in a reality that did not reflect their inner understanding. This raises an important question, Tai. If they could perceive so clearly, why were they unable to create change? Jung's answer challenged common assumptions about perception and reality. He concluded that what you are able to perceive in the external world is shaped primarily by your internal condition, not your intelligence, and not your effort, but the extent to which you truly understand yourself. This leads to a critical insight. You do not see reality as it objectively is, you see it as you are. Consider a general psychological profile based on these observations. A highly perceptive individual, what Jung would describe as an introverted intuitive, enters a room and immediately senses underlying dynamics. She can recognize dishonesty, feel tension behind polite expressions, and detect hidden resentment beneath friendly conversations. Yet, despite this heightened awareness, her own life continues to repeat the same painful patterns. The same types of people hurt her, and similar situations leave her feeling overlooked. Jung's conclusion was clear: her perception was not the issue. The issue was not her ability to perceive. The problem was that her unexamined inner world kept guiding her toward the same patterns she most needed to understand within herself. Through the mechanism of synchronicity, her internal psychology and her external circumstances were aligned, expressing the same underlying structure. The outer world was not working against her. It was reflecting her. This is what Carl Jung described as the psychological mirror, and it leads directly to a trap that prevents most people from changing their reality before they even recognize it. That trap is known as shadow projection, and it explains why many attempts at transformation fail from the start. To understand this, consider Jung's concept of the shadow. Every individual carries a shadow which consists of the parts of ourselves we reject, suppress, or refuse to acknowledge. This includes anger we consider unacceptable, jealousy we feel ashamed of, and fears we hide behind performance. It also includes traits that do not fit the identity we believe we are supposed to maintain. These aspects do not disappear when they are ignored. Instead, they are projected outward. You begin to notice them in others, in partners, co-workers, and even strangers. In many cases, the qualities you strongly dislike in others are the same qualities you resist recognizing within yourself. Jung examined this pattern extensively in his clinical work. He observed individuals who invested significant energy trying to control external situations, often confronting people who were reflecting their own denied traits. Meanwhile, the actual source of their experience remained unaddressed within them. To illustrate this pattern, consider a common scenario. A person strongly dislikes dishonesty and takes pride in being direct and truthful. He argues, confronts others, and repeatedly distances himself from people he perceives as dishonest. Yet, no matter where he goes, he continues to encounter the same behavior. The pattern repeats consistently. Jung's interpretation is clear. The conflict he is engaging in externally reflects a conflict he is unwilling to confront internally. Somewhere within his own shadow exists the same capacity for deception that he refuses to acknowledge. A part of him remains unrecognized, and until he acknowledges it, the mirror will continue reflecting the same image. This is why resisting the mirror is ineffective. You cannot change a reflection by striking the surface. You must change what stands before it. However, understanding this is only the starting point. Even when people accept this idea intellectually, they often remain stuck. The reason for this leads to one of the most important concepts identified by Carl Jung, something he referred to as participation mystique. Participation mystique describes a psychological state in which the boundary between the self and the external world becomes unclear. Jung adopted this term from the anthropologist Lucien L.A.V. Brühl to explain a more primitive level of consciousness, where there is no clear distinction between subject and object. In this state, the self and the environment feel merged, making it difficult to determine where one ends and the other begins. For many, this may sound abstract, but it has a very real expression in everyday experience. Consider a moment when you entered a room where two people had recently argued. Even if they were acting normal, you likely sensed the tension immediately. In a state of participation mystique, however, the experience goes further. You do not just notice the tension, you absorb it as if it were your own emotional condition. The boundary that separates your feelings from the environment becomes unclear. This is not simply heightened sensitivity, it reflects a form of ego boundary dissolution. Now extend this experience across every environment you move through each day. This becomes the reality for individuals with what Jung described as differentiated perception. Their surroundings are not just external, they move through them internally. Without a clear psychological boundary, there is little to regulate what is absorbed. This is not symbolic, it is a real psychological condition. It helps explain why individuals who genuinely want to change their lives often find themselves returning to the same patterns. They remain psychologically tied to a version of reality they did not consciously choose. For highly sensitive individuals, particularly those with differentiated perception, this creates a greater challenge. They do not only register obvious social cues, they also absorb the unspoken emotional atmosphere of those around them, including tension, suppressed emotions, and underlying intentions. It enters continuously until it becomes difficult to distinguish what truly belongs to you and what has been absorbed from the environment. Carl Jung described this as the double-edged nature of the superior function. In his theory of psychological types, the superior function represents your greatest strength, your most conscious and well-developed ability. For highly perceptive, intuitive individuals, this is the capacity to recognize patterns and interpret underlying dynamics with remarkable accuracy. However, this strength does not operate independently. It is paired with what Jung called the inferior function, the least developed and most unconscious part of the personality. When the superior function is overused, when perception operates continuously without pause or integration, the inferior function becomes activated. It overwhelms the system. As a result, what once functioned as a strength begins to produce emotional instability, mental overload, and a sense of paralysis. The ability itself has not disappeared, but it is now being influenced by a part of the psyche that is not equipped to manage it effectively. You may notice what others overlook, but observation alone is not sufficient. Jung's work consistently pointed toward the next step, a step that most individuals avoid. This leads to the practical process of reprogramming the mind, not as an abstract idea, but through clear and structured steps. The first step is what Jung referred to as identifying projections. It is one of the most essential and often neglected practices in psychology because it requires confronting something the ego naturally resists. You must examine what disturbs you in others and ask, with honesty, where that same quality exists within you. This is not about assigning blame or viewing yourself negatively. It is about redirecting attention from external reflections back to their internal source. In doing so, you reclaim the energy that is otherwise spent reacting to the outer world. To apply this practically, think of someone in your life who consistently triggers a strong emotional response. Not necessarily someone who has caused clear harm, but someone whose behavior creates a reaction that feels stronger than expected. That disproportionate response is significant. It indicates that a projection may be active. At that point, ask yourself a direct question: if this trait exists within me in some form, how might it appear? Where could it be hidden? Under what different expression might it be present? You do not need a perfect answer. The act of asking the question honestly is enough to begin shifting your perspective. In that moment, you stop reacting to the reflection, and that is when the pattern starts to change. This is where the process becomes counterintuitive. Most people assume that doing inner work will feel like weakness, self-blame, or excusing others. In reality, it feels like none of those things. It feels like control. The moment you recognize a projection within yourself, you are no longer controlled by the person who was triggering it. You reclaim the control you had been unconsciously giving away. Carl Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his case studies. When individuals stopped directing their energy toward changing others and instead focused inward, a meaningful shift occurred. The external situation did not immediately change, but their relationship to it did. They developed the psychological strength to make different decisions, establish clearer boundaries, and respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. As a result, new actions became possible, and different outcomes followed, not because the world changed, but because the individual developed a stable internal foundation. The second step in this process is what Jung described as shadow integration, and this is where the process becomes more effective. Shadow integration is not about becoming more negative, it is about becoming more complete. Many people operate with only part of their potential available to them, while the rest remains suppressed. Emotions and traits that were once rejected, such as anger labeled as dangerous, ambition dismissed as selfish, or strength seen as threatening, do not disappear. They remain active beneath awareness, creating pressure within the unconscious and expressing themselves in uncontrolled ways. This happens because they have never been consciously acknowledged or directed. Integration involves recognizing these parts and engaging with them directly. The goal is not to express them without control, but to bring them into awareness and place them under conscious direction instead of leaving them unregulated. To better understand this shift, Consider a recurring pattern that Jung documented. It often begins with an individual who appears consistently gentle, agreeable, and highly patient. People begin to take advantage of them, treating their constant giving as something to use. They come to believe that softness defines who they are. At the same time, they remain unaware of the part of themselves capable of firm boundaries, because that aspect was suppressed early in life. Then a turning point occurs, a betrayal that cannot be dismissed or justified, a moment when the pattern becomes clear. If they respond constructively, they do not collapse or react destructively. Instead, they integrate. They reconnect with the strength they had previously suppressed. As a result, a shift takes place not only in their behavior but also in how others respond to them. Situations that once felt overwhelming become manageable. Individuals who previously overstepped begin to recognize the change and adjust their behavior. This is what Carl Jung described as shadow integration in highly sensitive individuals. It is not a breakdown, it is a form of development. Their kindness remains, but it is now supported by strength. This combination creates a different presence. The world does not respond to an idealized version of you. It responds to the full reality of who you are, including the parts you have not yet acknowledged. The third step Jung outlined is what he referred to as conscious sensitivity. This is where the change becomes stable rather than temporary. Many highly perceptive individuals experience their sensitivity as a weakness. They feel overwhelmed, take in too much, and notice patterns that others overlook or deny. As a result, they are often criticized for expressing what they observe. Over time, they begin to doubt their own perception, apologize for their clarity, and reduce the intensity of their awareness because others find it uncomfortable. Jung's perspective was different. Instead of treating perception as a problem to control, he emphasized developing it as a precise tool. The difference between being overwhelmed by sensitivity and using it effectively depends on one key factor: discernment. The key psychological skill is the ability to recognize which signals belong to you, which ones you have absorbed from your environment, and what each of those signals actually represents. Carl Jung taught his patients to develop what he called conscious discrimination. This required daily solitude, not passive rest, but intentional separation from external influences. It is a form of quiet that allows the mind to settle, making it possible to distinguish between your own internal state and what you may be carrying from others. When this practice is developed, a noticeable shift occurs. Sensitivity, which once felt overwhelming, begins to function as a form of early awareness. Instead of reacting late, you begin to recognize patterns sooner. Your nervous system has been processing information all along. You simply learn how to interpret it. This reflects the balance Jung described. When the superior function is no longer overactive and the inferior function is no longer disrupting from beneath awareness, internal conflict begins to reduce. You are no longer suppressing perception or being overwhelmed by it. Instead, you are applying it deliberately, with a clear understanding of where the information originates. A highly perceptive individual, once integrated, does not lose sensitivity. Rather, they develop selective sensitivity. They decide where to direct their attention and what deserves their energy. That level of choice becomes one of the most effective ways to shape the mind. Jung observed this outcome in individuals who progressed through the full process of individuation. Consider a general example based on these patterns. A person who once absorbed every environment they entered begins to move through situations with greater control. They remain adaptable and responsive, but no longer undefined. They choose how to engage rather than being shaped entirely by external conditions. They can connect deeply when appropriate and step back when necessary. Over time, a sense of stability and authority develops, not because something new was added, but because something essential was finally acknowledged. Now it is important to consider the alternative. This is not a theoretical idea, it has practical consequences. Jung spent years documenting what happens when perception remains unintegrated and the shadow continues to operate without awareness. He identified a clear outcome for individuals who avoid this process. He referred to this as possession not in a supernatural sense, but in a precise psychological one. Carl Jung used the term to describe what happens when an unconscious complex or archetype overrides the ego. The individual does not lose awareness in an obvious way, but they lose control over their direction. An unintegrated part of the psyche takes over, and the conscious self becomes passive within its own life. It is important to be clear here. Jung also described collective possession, where large groups are influenced by shared psychological forces. However, at the individual level, the concern is personal possession, when the ego is dominated by unconscious elements that were never examined. Personal possession occurs when the ego is overwhelmed by a complex that remains unaddressed. Decision-making weakens and behavior becomes reactive. Instead of acting with intention, the individual responds automatically according to patterns shaped by the unconscious. Perception is guided by projections, and reactions are influenced by absorbed emotional material. Over time, the reflection becomes the only frame of reference, and the individual begins to operate within a narrative shaped by internal forces they do not consciously recognize. For highly sensitive and perceptive individuals, this process can be especially subtle. It does not always appear as a clear breakdown. More often, it presents as exhaustion, a gradual loss of clarity, or a withdrawal from engagement that may appear thoughtful, but is actually a form of disengagement. Trust in personal perception begins to weaken because past experiences have been overwhelming. Motivation to seek new experiences declines because similar patterns continue to repeat. Gradually, the individual's sense of presence reduces within a life that once held greater potential. What makes this particularly difficult is that others may not notice the process itself, only the outcome. A person who was once expressive becomes quiet. Someone who previously demonstrated strong awareness begins to withdraw from it. The change is gradual, not sudden, and over time even the individual may lose awareness of what they once experienced. Jung identified this as a common pattern in his clinical observations, not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual diminishing of engagement. He also described another form of breakdown, often referred to as the empath reaching a breaking point. In this case, instead of withdrawal, there is a sudden shift in the opposite direction. An individual who has suppressed their shadow for an extended period while continuously absorbing the emotional states of others eventually reaches a limit. Because integration did not occur consciously, when the shadow emerges, it does so without balance or control. It lacks the structure and awareness that would allow it to be expressed constructively, often leading to reactions that are intense rather than measured. The tragedy is not that this process occurs, it is that it is entirely preventable. The shadow has always been present, knocking, waiting to be consciously acknowledged and integrated. When the door is never opened by choice, the shadow forces its way in. This is why Carl Jung emphasized the urgency of the individuation process. It is not merely a spiritual pursuit. It is a psychological necessity for anyone who has carried the weight of unprocessed perception over time. But here is where the transformation begins. Once the mind is properly reprogrammed, something remarkable occurs. Jung described this as the turn toward self-knowledge. When projections are withdrawn and the shadow is consciously integrated, the external world does not change magically. Instead, your relationship to it changes. Perception sharpens. Patterns that once seemed chaotic begin to reveal meaning, what Jung called synchronistic events. You stop reacting unconsciously and begin responding from a grounded sense of self-awareness. From this foundation, the choices available to you are fundamentally different. This is not wishful thinking, it is the psychological logic of integration. When you stop relating to the world through a fragmented inner lens, you no longer perpetuate patterns created by that fragmentation. By bringing the shadow into consciousness, opportunities, relationships, and possibilities that were previously inaccessible become reachable, not because the universe rewards you, but because you have developed the psychological stamina to engage with reality as it truly is, rather than as your unexamined patterns dictated. Consider the transformation Jung observed in patients who completed the individuation process. A composite profile emerges. Someone who once felt victimized by their own perceptions now reads situations before others even recognize them. Someone who formerly absorbed the realities of everyone around them now maintains clear boundaries, choosing where their energy flows and how it is invested. Someone whose sensitivity once felt like a burden becomes the most strategically aware person in any environment they enter. Their external circumstances do more than improve, they transform. Work is informed by the ability to genuinely understand what others need. Relationships are built on seeing beyond appearances without fear of what lies underneath. Life begins to feel authored, not merely endured. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said the individuated person does not retreat from the world, but engages with it consciously. The goal is not to see less, but to see more wisely. You are not meant to be overwhelmed by your perceptions, you were meant to use them. The reality you seek is not waiting out there for you to earn it, it is shaped by the depth of your self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is not fixed. It is cultivated deliberately and consciously on your own terms. Jung spent his career demonstrating that the most dangerous human is not the one who sees everything, but the one who sees everything and never learns to act on it. A gift without integration becomes simply pain in higher resolution. The difference between someone destroyed by perception and someone transformed by it comes down to one thing: the willingness to do the inner work. To identify projections, integrate what has been suppressed, and wield what was always meant to be a strength rather than a wound. That is the path. That is the work. That is what Jung devoted his life to revealing. Now it is your turn. In the Alchemist's Path Perception Training for Empaths, you will transform overwhelm into clarity with practical exercises, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, it is a 236-page, beautifully designed 5x11-inch downloadable ebook available now. Begin your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Access the Alchemist Path at surrealmind.com.